Hello and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our columnists, Phil Christman. We're going to be chatting about a recent essay he wrote for us in praise of unruly children in church. So we're going to dive into all of those themes. But first, Phil, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm a columnist for the Christian Century. I've written two books. I have a third one coming out in September. It's called Why Christians Should Be Leftists. I decided not to beat around the bush with the title. Uh, so that's coming out from Erdman's. And I teach first year English at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Uh, and this is my office. Welcome to my office.
That's great. Well, thanks for being here. Excited to chat about this. In the beginning of the essay, you spend a little time at length describing all the reasons you don't like going to church, how it's always kind of been a struggle for you. I found this to be very relatable. I'm curious, it seems like you keep going. And so I'm curious what keeps bringing you back to church if it is as difficult an experience as you describe it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I do feel like that's a bit of that's probably partly like a character deficiency. Like I'm not trying to brag about it too much. But yeah, as a kid, I found it very boring. And I didn't get along with the other kids and, just banal stuff like that. And I hated the music. We were fundamentalists. So it was uh, like musically we transitioned from like the stodgiest sort of pseudo revival hymns of the 20s through the 50s to like just the slickest praise choruses and half the people got mad and left over this, and it was like this huge struggle to go from like one kind of terrible music to the other. And then, I grew up, got to explore a little more. I discovered the main line and like there, well, sometimes there are ways in which like the main line can set the bar a little higher. Like a at a one thing that I liked about being Episcopalian was that like even if you got like the worst preaching in the world and the church sucked and people were unfriendly and it was just every bad cliche or stereotype about Episcopalians, like there was so much good stuff already baked into the service and you were required to participate more. um but yeah, I don't know. I have ADHD, like there's that kind of stuff, so it can be hard for me to stick with even habits that are good for me or that I enjoy. And I don't know, there just haven't, with the exception of one church in Minnesota and one church in Milwaukee and kind of the place that I go now. It's just always been a little bit of a struggle. And part of the answer to the question, like why do I go anyway, is contained in the column that we're discussing. Every not just in the sense that like I talk about how misbehaving children are really funny and I relate to them during the service, which is that's kind of the surface argument of the piece. But I think another argument the piece makes is that if you keep going, stuff happens that then makes you kind of say, well, I got to keep going, the essay kind of concludes with an anecdote that exemplifies that. But I keep going because, a lot of theologians have argued that this is just one of the practices that is constitutive of being a Christian. Like this is just how you act that out. And I find that those arguments convincing. And so, it feels if like I skip sometimes, but I always end up returning for that reason. And I will say, since the slant of this article is pretty negative and it represents many years of negative experiences, also the place I'm going now, yeah, I really like, mostly mostly because I think the people are terrific. So Yeah, that was not a very satisfying answer, but
No,
very helpful.
I'm satisfied. I leave it to the viewers to decide. No, I let's jump straight to the end of the essay since you brought it up. You share this story of a conversation with a young girl. That it's the whole story is pretty delightful. This group of unsupervised children start coming to your church, and at one point, this girl is shocked at the idea that Jesus died, and you it seems to be that what you're saying in the essay is that the reason this was such a significant moment for you is that she helped reveal to you kind of how absurd or how extreme a lot of these claims are that we make in our faith. But I wondered if you could tell us a little more about the impact of that conversation for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I want to say for those of you who haven't read the essay yet, like I say this in the essay, but I'm solemnly averring, or however you pronounce that, again. Like that anecdote really happened. I did not make it up. If I made it up for the sake of the essay, I mean, not only would that be dishonest, but also it would be way too sentimental and unbelievable to actually make for a good column. Like it's so on the nose, but occasionally something happens in life that is like, sometimes God just ignores all my sort of Henry Jamesian ideas about subtlety. And it's just like, here's a thing. Um, so what happened was we had this group of kids that started coming to church because we just sort of canvassed our neighborhood and let people know we're there. And these kids were in I think, like, I'm not trying to, like, throw shade on anybody, but pretty dire poverty, and they had overwhelmed caregivers, and they were excited to have a place just to go hang out and be welcome, and their caregivers were excited to have a safe space that they could just kind of hang out at, especially in the summers. And so they just started coming to the church every day, and our rector, Polly Hilsebeck, would give them like cereal to eat or whatever, and they would just hang out. And so then, they started coming to the services regularly, and some of them wanted to go through confirmation. One of them joined the choir, uh, and I was part of the group of people that just sort of, like, my wife Ashley and I, we would just let the kids sit with us and just try to model how you act during church. Um, and one day, yeah, we were going through the liturgy as usual, the pre-communion part of it, and Polly goes, he died, and this little girl looks up at me. He what? Like, super dramatically, and I was just like, you're so right, dude. You are so right. This is a faith based on the idea that just as always happens in life, a really righteous person um, came along and lived and taught and was in conflict with institutions and with other people, and was in conflict even with the and sometimes most sharply with the people that he was closest to ideologically. The Zealots and the Pharisees. I think when we read the Gospels, we should be like, most of us are not even like good enough at being Christians to like aspire to be like Jesus. We should look at the Pharisees and be like, man, these people are way more morally serious and rigorous than most of us. Um, like we like should aspire to be good enough that Jesus has to tell us off. Like, these are the people he's ideologically, closest to, and he's also in conflict with the state. And what happens when somebody lives their life like that? What happens to a Dietrich Bonhoeffer? What happens to a Martin Luther King? What happens to a Rachel Corrie? What happens to these young kids that have been like abducted off the street by ICE because they wrote an op-ed saying, hey, maybe it's bad when, like, Israel tries to kill like every Palestinian on earth. Maybe we should calm down on that a little bit, what happens is you get crushed, you know, you get imprisoned or you get killed. And one time that happened, and then the guy just came back because turns out he was God. Like that's what we're doing here. If I weren't trying to hold that possibility in my imagination, I wouldn't bother going to church at all. Uh, that's just what that implies about the world is so topsy-turvy. Um, and most of the time, like in the same way that you can't walk around, loving your spouse or your cat or your kids as much as like you can't feel the full force of your love for those people 24/7, or you'd run out of energy and die, you know. Uh, and in the same way, I can't just walk around like with the full reality that Jesus was God, and the the powers that crush goodness are not always going to win, and all of that, and that there will be a reckoning for Bonhoeffer and King and Rachel Corrie and whoever, that where they come out the winners. Like I can't live with the full reality of that, or I just never do anything, uh I just be like, um and to have that kid manifest the full craziness of what we're claiming in that moment was, I was like, yeah, good point, kid. And so then I tried to say something, wholesome, and just say a bunch of theologically correct things to give that kid something to sort of ground that emotion that they were having, that she was having. But I have no idea if I succeeded. I think I'm very sure that I learned more from her than she did from me.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that story with us. The last thing I wanted to ask you, one of the reasons you give in the essay for why you think it's a good thing for these unruly kids to be in church is that their reaction, in a way, at least this is how I read it, it issues a certain critique to the liturgy,
Yep.
um, and that maybe God is joining them in that critique. You
Yeah.
you you
Yeah.
you give an image of the Holy Spirit blowing a raspberry along with like an infant or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
we obviously don't know like what God is thinking or feeling, but I wonder how you imagine God receives or reacts to these somber, solemn worship services we keep putting on together.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the themes that keeps emerging from the Bible, like the more I engage with it and the older I get, is like God seems to do this sort of almost dialectical thing with us where God sets up a thing so that God can then knock it down. I always because of the relevance of this for this particular passage for arguing for LGBTQ inclusion in church and church leadership. I think a lot about the kind of curve of the Hebrew Bible that goes from no eunuchs, no eunuchs, keep those eunuchs away from me. We don't like eunuchs. To then in Isaiah being like, eunuchs are my special little guys. You think I don't like eunuchs? I love eunuchs, Um, and like, what is that about? Like logically, that doesn't really hold up. And I don't think it can ever be the case that God was ever really like, "Ugh, eunuchs." Um, so I think what that's really saying is that there's something about like God needing to to speak through these sort of standard human reflexes of putting boundaries around things in order to establish something as holy. Because that's, I don't know, that's kind of how the idea of the holy tends to work, but then overthrowing them. Um, and so I mean, I think church is probably part of the same dialectic, or what. I don't ask the Marxists if I'm using that word correctly, but the same apparent contradiction that is actually like an overall system. God, like we got to do, if we believe this stuff, we got to do something, and we've got to sort of like help each other, uh like kind of, we have to be each other's school for believing and acting, and so that seems to require some sort of, like, the most obvious thing to do there is put something on the calendar, and get together regularly and do certain things that feel central. And God like says, "Do this in remembrance of me." So that's like a pretty, Jesus says that, and so that's a pretty powerful argument for, like, let's regularly meet up and do something, because we're Christians. So I think, yeah, I think God recognizes, that we're trying to do the right thing there, and I think God also, you know, here's that here's that we can't sing, or worse, that we can sing, and our choir is really good, and we're a little stuck up about it, like the God notices our aesthetic, uh, the ways we don't make the cut aesthetically, and then God notices the way we don't make the cut morally, which are worse. And God notices, all of our hypocrisy, including the stuff that is like front of mind that we're feeling really bad about and we're burdened with, and the stuff that we, aren't even like insightful enough to know about ourselves. So God sees that we're trying and doesn't want us to stop trying. And sometimes the nicest thing God can say is, I'm, that kid that always like gets up and runs around during the Eucharist. I'm gonna make her do that every week. I'm gonna make her do that every week. And you guys better be cool about it, you know? Uh, or whatever, the kid who starts going during the most solemn part of the service, like whatever it is, that is God saying, I see you. Nice job. Keep it up. You kind of suck though, but I love you anyway.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, you've given us a lot to think about. Anyone out there who missed this article, there will be a link where you can read it in the video description below, along with a link to Phil's Substack where you can read his other writings. Thanks so much for chatting today, Phil.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and yeah, thanks to the Christian Centuries readers who've been a really really good audience for this column so far. I've gotten some really nice, emails from, like, all sorts of, random people, and yeah, that's, God bless all of you. Keep it up.
Thanks. Cut it somewhere around there.